This is one of the topics that probably I get the most questions about. And I plan on doing a film on this subject in the future. And really the New World Order control, the cult of Dionysus, and how it relates to rock music. So I thought today, being the, what is this, the 28th anniversary of the shooting of John Lennon from the Beatles. So I thought that would be, since today is the anniversary of that shooting, I thought we would read out of Dr. John Coleman, the Committee of 300, author of the book, The Committee of 300. Michael Vale has told me he's trying to get him on the program, on the Intel Strike Report. But, so I thought it would be interesting today to read out of the Committee of 300, the Beatles and the Aquarian Conspiracy, here on the day of the 20th anniversary of the assassination of John Lennon. An outstanding example of social conditioning to accept change, even when it is recognized as unwelcome change by the large population group in the sites of the Stanford Research Institute, was the advent of the Beatles. The Beatles were brought to the United States as part of a social experiment which will subject large population groups to brainwashing of which they were not even aware. When Tavistock brought the Beatles to the United States, nobody could have imagined the cultural disaster that was to follow in their wake. The Beatles were an integral part of the Aquarian Conspiracy, a living organism which sprang from the changing images of man. Year H49-2150, the Policy Research Report number on 474. The policy report prepared by the SRI Center for the Study of Social Policy Director Professor Willis Harman. The phenomenon of the Beatles was not a spontaneous rebellion by youth against the old social system. Instead, it was a carefully crafted plot to introduce a conspiratorial body which could not be identified. A highly destructive and divisive element into a large population group targeted for change against its will. New words and new phrases prepared by the Tavistock Institute were introduced into America along with the Beatles. Words such as rock, in relation to music sounds, teenager, cool, discovered, and pop music were a lexicon of disguised code words signifying the acceptance of drugs and arrived with and accompanied the Beatles wherever they went, to be discovered by teenagers. Incidentally, the word teenagers was never used until just before the Beatles arrived on the scene, courtesy of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. As in the case of gang wars, nothing could or would have been accomplished without the cooperation of the media, especially the electronic media, and in particular, the scurrilous Ed Sullivan, who had been coached by the conspirators as the role he was to play. Nobody would have paid much attention to the motley crew from Liverpool and the 12-atonal system of music that was to follow had it not been for an overabundance of press exposure. The 12-atonal system consisted of heavy, repetitive sounds taken from the music of the cult of Dionysus and the Baal priesthood by Adorno, and given a modern flavor by this special friend of the Queen of England, and hence the Committee of 300. Now that is true. Now that the 12-atonal system of music, it's a 12-atonal system in which chords are designed in a certain way. He's exactly right. I mean, John Coleman, who wrote this, who's an ex-MI6, ex-TAP, I mean, this guy was there. But the 12-atonal system consisted of heavy, repetitive sounds taken from the music of the cult of Dionysus and the Baal priesthood by Adorno, and gave a modern flavor by the special friend of Queen of England, and hence the Committee of 300. Tavistock and its Stanford Research Center created trigger words, which then came into general usage around rock music and its fans. Trigger words created a distinct new breakaway, largely young population group, which was persuaded by social engineering and conditioning to believe that the Beatles really were their favorite group. All trigger words devised in the context of rock music were designed for mass control of the new targeted group, the youth of America. The Beatles did a perfect job, or perhaps it would be more correct to say that the Tavistock and the Stanford Research Institute did a perfect job. The Beatles were merely reacting like trained robots, with a little help from their friends, code words for using drugs and making it cool. The Beatles became a highly visible new type, more Tavistock jargon, and as such it was not long before the group made new styles, fads in clothing, hairstyles, and language usage, which upset the older generation, as was intended. This was part of the fragmentation maladaptation process worked out by Willis Harman and his team of social scientists and genetic engineering tinkers and put into action. The role of the print and electronic media in our society is crucial to the success of brainwashing large population groups. Gang wars ended in Los Angeles in 1966 as the media withdrew its coverage. The same thing will happen with the current wave of gang wars in Los Angeles. Street gangs will wither on the vine once media saturation coverage is toned down and then completely withdrawn. As in 1966, the issue will become burned out. Street gangs will serve their purpose of creating turbulence and insecurity. Exactly the same pattern will be followed in the case of rock music. Deprived of media attention, it will eventually take its place in history. Following the Beatles, who incidentally were put together by the Tavistock Institute, came other made-in-England rock groups who, like the Beatles, had Theo Adorno write their cult lyrics and compose all the music. I hate to use these beautiful words in the context of Beatlemania. It reminds me how wrongly the word lover is when referring to the filthy interaction between the rock music lovers and others. To call rock music is an insult, likewise the language used in rock lyrics. Tavistock and Stanford Research then embarked on the second phase of the work commissioned by the Committee of 300. This new phase turned up the heat for social change in America. As quickly as the Beatles had appeared on the American scene, so did the Beat Generation, trigger words designed to separate and fragment society. The media now focused its attention on the Beat Generation. Other Tavistock coined words came seemingly out of nowhere. Beatniks, hippies, flower children became part of the vocabulary of America. It became popular to drop out and wear dirty jeans, go about with long unwashed hair. The Beat Generation cut itself off from mainstream America. They became just as infamous as the cleaner Beatles before them. And so we'll stop right there, and we'll pick up that on the other side. I thought it would be interesting to talk about that, Dango, some of that research, considering this is the 28th anniversary of the World Vision MK Ultra assassination of John F. Kennedy. Just John F. Kennedy, of John Lennon. So we'll talk more about this on the other side. This is the Monday edition of the Global Reality. I'm your host, Josh Reeves. Stay with us. I thought it would be important. It's one of the most paradigm busting things for people to realize is the pervasive influence of the New World Order into rock music. And believe me, I mean, I come from a musician background. I mean, next year will be 15 years that I've been playing in bands and whatnot. And I think I'm actually going to come out with like a retrospective CD. I think I'm going to go back and record versions of every song that I've ever written from the time I was 16 up until now, and put that out and have commentary in there as well. But believe me, a lot of people, as soon as you tell them that the Beatles were created by MI6 and the Tavistock Institute, they cringe. They don't want to hear it because it shatters their paradigm of control. But I plan on making a film in the future on the Dionysus cults. I mean, look into Jim Morrison alone. The guy called himself the reincarnation of Dionysus. He called himself the Lizard King. He was known to go on stage and say that you're all a bunch of effing slaves. His dad was high-level Navy. In fact, somebody I think was telling me last night that that Jim Morrison's dad was actually the guy that sort of got the ball rolling on Vietnam, which is interesting of itself. But let's get back into this. Although this will be important today since this is the anniversary of the assassination of John Winston Lennon, I think we would talk about the origins of the Beatles and the whole counterculture movement, because it was created by the intelligence operation. I mean, there's no doubt, folks. The newly created group and its lifestyle swept millions of young Americans into the cult. America's youth underwent a radical revolution without even being aware of it. While the older generation stood by helplessly, unable to identify the source of the crisis, and thus reacting in a maladaptive manner against its manifestation, which were drugs of all types, marijuana and later lysergic acid, so conveniently provided for them by the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz, following the discovery by one of its chemists, Albert Hofmann, on how to make synthetic argotamine a powerful mind-altering drug. The Committee of 300 financed the project through one of their banks, the S.C. Warburg, and the drug was carried into America by the philosopher Aldous Huxley. And, of course, that is true. Of course, the Warburgs, you know, I mean, they're one of the most predominant bankers. I mean, my goodness. So there you go. LSD was funded by the Warburgs and the Committee of 300, folks. And, of course, it was brought here by Aldous Huxley. And, of course, what did Aldous Huxley say? You've heard the quote by him. It's in the intro. Lee Rogers has a clip of it in his intro where he says, you know, it'd be possible to control people's minds by providing them with endless breads and circuses and endless distractions. And I think he made that quote, I don't know, in 30s or 40s or something. With very substantial numbers of new British rock bands arriving in the U.S., rock concerts began to become a fixture on the social calendar of American youth. In tandem with these concerts, the use of drugs among the youth rose in proportion. The devilish bedlam of discordant heavy beat sounds numbed the minds of listeners so that they were easily persuaded to try the new drug on the basis that everybody is doing it. Peer pressure is a very strong weapon. The new culture received maximum coverage from the Jackal media, which cost the conspirators not one single thin dime. Great anger was felt by a number of civic leaders and churchmen over their new cult, but their energies were misdirected against the result of what was going on and not against the cause. Critics of the rock cult made the same mistakes that had been made in the Prohibition era. They criticized law enforcement agencies, teachers, parents, anybody but the conspirators. And that, you know, I don't know if you guys are aware of of course, the Grateful Dead. I mean, my goodness, folks. Look up to that. And I have no doubt that some of these modern day type of hippie jam bands like Fish and others are probably intelligence operatives. I mean, of course, the Grateful Dead were. No doubt about it. I mean, have you guys ever... the acid experiments that the Grateful Dead did. I mean, they do these concerts, they would just inject apples full of liquid LSD and just hand them to people at the door. And they did a concert, and this has actually been proven by people that were there and some of the bootleggers of shows. There was actually a show that they did one time. It was a CIA-ran acid experiment in Los Angeles, or San Francisco, rather. And what they did is they brought a bunch of people into a venue. They dosed them all with LSD at the door. And then they played a recording, right? With lights and visuals. And these people tripped out, right? With lights, and it was booming lights and the smoke machine and fog machines. And they were tripping out. They actually believed they witnessed a Grateful Dead concert. But, folks, the Grateful Dead wasn't there. What they did was they played a live recording from one of their previous concerts, and then subsequently told everyone it was a concert. But what they were doing is they were trying to see if, through the use of psychedelic drugs, they could convince people that they were perceiving a different reality than they wanted to be seeing. And so, what's interesting is the fact that the bootleggers have gone back in the expanse of time. There were people that had bootleg recordings of that show where they weren't even there. Then you can take that and you compare it with the other show, the source show it was from, and it's the same show. That makes you wonder about how many times stuff like this happened that we don't know about. Because of the anger and resentment I feel toward the great drug plague, I make no apology for using language which is not customary for me to use. One of the worst drug slobs ever to walk the streets of America was Allen Ginsberg. This Ginsberg pushed the use of LSD through advertising, which cost him nothing, although under normal circumstances it would have cost millions of dollars in TV ad revenues. This free advertising for drugs and LSD in particular reached a new high in the late 1960s thanks to the ever-willing cooperation of the media. The effect of Ginsberg's mass advertising campaign was devastating. The American public was subjected to one cultural future shock after another in rapid succession. We became overexposed and overstimulated, and again, may I remind you of this Tavistock jargon lifted from the Tavistock training manual, overwhelmed by its new development, and when we reached that point, our minds began to lapse into apathy. It was just too much to cope with. That is to say, long-range penetration had taken a hold of us. Ginsberg claimed to be a poet, but no rather rubbish was ever written by anyone who ever aspired to become a poet. Ginsberg's designated task had little to do with poetry. His main function was to push the new subculture and force acceptance upon the large targeted population group. To assist him in his task, Ginsberg called to the services of Norman Mailer, a writer of sorts who had spent some time in a mental institution. Mailer was a favorite of the left-wing Hollywood crowd, and so had no problem with getting maximum television time for Ginsberg. Naturally, Mailer had to have a pretext. Not even he could blatantly come out with the true nature of Ginsberg's television appearances, so a charade was adapted. Mailer would talk seriously on camera with Ginsberg about poetry and literature. The method of getting wide television coverage at no cost to themselves was followed by every rock group and concert promoter who followed the example set by Ginsberg. The electronic media moguls had big hearts when it came to giving free time to these dirty, verminous creatures, and their even dirtier projects and filthy ideas. The promotion of horrible garbage spoke volumes. Without abundant help from the print and electronic media, the drug trade did not have spread as rapidly as it did in the late 60s, early 70s, and probably would have been confined to a few small local areas. Ginsberg was able to give several national televised performances extolling the virtues of LSD and marijuana under the guise of new ideas and new cultures developing in the art and music world. Not to be outdone by the electronic media, Ginsberg's admirers wrote glowing articles about this colorful man in the art and social columns of all America's largest newspapers and magazines. There had never been such an across-the-media board free advertising campaign in the history of newspaper, radio, and television, and it cost promoters of the Aquarian Conspiracy, NATO, and the Club of Rome not one red cent. It was all absolutely free advertising for LSD, only thinly disguised as art and culture. Worse yet, or better yet, depending on your viewpoint, United Press, UP, picked up on Kenny Love's free advertising for Ginsberg and LSD and telexed it to hundreds of newspapers and magazines around the country under the guise of a news story. Even such highly respectable establishment magazines as Harper's Bazaar and Time made Ginsberg respectable. If a nationwide campaign of this magnitude were presented to Ginsberg and the promoters of LSD by an advertising agency, the price tag would have run into at least $1 million in terms of 1970 dollars. Today, the price tag would be nothing less than $25 to $30 million. It was no wonder that I referred to this new media as jackals. I suggest that we try to find any media outlet to do an expose on the Federal Reserve Board, which is what I did. I took my article, which was a good expose of the greatest swindle on earth, to every major newspaper, radio, and television station, magazine house, and several talk show hosts. A few made promises that sounded good. They would definitely air the article and have me discuss it. Give them about a week and they would get back to me. None of them never did. Nor did my article ever appear in the pages of their newspapers and journals. It was as if a blanket of silence had been thrown over me on the subject of the Federal Reserve, and I was endeavoring to promote, and indeed that was precisely what had happened. Without massive media hype and without almost around-the-clock coverage, the hippie beatnik rock drug culture would have never gotten off the ground, and it would have remained a localized oddity. The Beatles, with their twanging guitars, silly expressions, drug language, and weird clothes, would not have amounted to a hill of beans. Instead, because the Beatles were giving saturation coverage by the media, the United States had suffered one cultural shock after another. The men buried in the think tanks and research institutions whose names and faces are still not known but to a few people made sure that the press played its part. Conversely, the media's important role in not exposing the power behind the future culture shocks made certain that the source of the crisis was never identified. Thus was our society driven mad through these psychological shocks and stress. Driven mad is taken from the Tavistock training manual. From its modest beginnings in 1921, Tavistock was ready in 1966 to launch a major irreversible cultural revolution in America, which has not yet ended. The Aquarian Conspiracy is a part of it. And you know what's interesting is that you look at a band like Pink Floyd, who started out with their singer Syd Barrett, who inevitably drove himself mad from LSD. Then they brought on, all of a sudden they went from this sort of relatively obscure band, and then they brought in Dave Gilmour on guitar and vocals, and then all of a sudden Pink Floyd starts to take off. And of course, you look into Dave Gilmour, and he's a member of all these royal groups, and most of these British groups are all OTO members anyway, Ordo Templi Orientis. But one of the interesting things, of course, about Pink Floyd, of course, they ended up splitting off with Roger Waters, and then forming back with their own version with Dave Gilmour at the head. But you got Pink Floyd The Wall, which is essentially a diatribe for the loss of the animus, or loss of the father figure. So this person becomes a rock star and engages in all sorts of debauchery, and engages in becoming this cult of personality Hitler type figure because of the loss of his father figure in his life. And there's all sorts of great ideas in there about we don't need no education and rebelling against the system. And of course, what do we see now in the modern day with Roger Waters? Well, Roger Waters is, these people have all become stooges, New World Order stooges. You got Roger Waters out shilling for Obama. Oh, so we're supposed to believe that, don't follow the lemmings, don't follow the sheep off into the meat grinder, as they depict the kids, falling off, walking in line, being all alike, walking into the meat grinder in the wall. And then, of course, here comes Roger Waters saying, "Oh, I love Obama. Vote for Obama." He's, So which one is it there, Roger? Is it don't follow the herd and don't fall into the meat grinder, or should we just go ahead and blindly fall into the meat grinder? You tell us what we're supposed to do. You're the gods. We're not. We're just the happy followers of rock music. More on the other side. This is the Global Reality. Stay with us. I want to continue talking about the Beatles and the whole connection. Of course, today is the 28th anniversary of the assassination of John Lennon, so I want to continue on this topic for now. Why Bush and the CIA had John Lennon killed, the Beatles, the Montauk Project, and the Tavistock Institute, and mass social control. This is from theconformist.com, which is Anthony J. Hilder's website. And big shout out to my friend Anthony J. Hilder there. And has put links to Oracle Broadcasting, and he's put links to the Global Reality up on his websites, which is just great. And so this comes from his website. Today is the birthday of is the anniversary of the assassination of Beatle John Lennon. In honor of the man and his wonderful music, Newstalk Incorporated has decided to take a look at what's going on behind the scenes of the 1960s countercultural revolution to explore a bit how the world's most popular, undeniably talented rock band was without any doubt used by the New World Order social manipulators in an ongoing project designed to control the development of human society in the most fundamental ways. There are direct links with these activities to certain covert scientific projects of an extremely advanced esoteric nature, which were exploring the realms of the manipulation of consciousness, time, thought, and indeed reality itself, which will be conducted during the same period on Long Island, New York activities, which were part of the Phoenix/Montauk Project. In fact, we are talking about two sides of the same coin here. On one side, the covert, subtle manipulation and control of not only thought of human consciousness, but the most fundamental subatomic electromagnetic matrix of perceived reality itself, using newly developed electromagnetic radio frequency technologies of extraordinary, unheard of power and potential. On the other hand, directly and overtly shifting the paradigm changing the basic concepts and widening the perimeters, the envelope, changing the playing field, and all the rules of play by which society defines itself within an exceptionally short period of time. Factor in what was happening on more political levels, such as the civil rights and anti-war movements, stir briskly while at full boil and stand back. What's rather amazing, in fact, is that society did not disintegrate, implode, or explode in the way the social manipulators have apparently hoped. The higher qualities of human nature seem to consistently float to the surface, with some notable exceptions, and certainly began to acquire a significant, if not nearly irresistible, momentum of its own, pulling in a larger segments of straight, conventional, more majority type of society. Obviously, the big plan was backfiring severely, and something needed to be done. Well, that's right. I think that's an aspect of it I think that needs to be focused in on. Is the fact that it did get out of their hands. It did get out of control. It did become... It was originally... Yes, it's true. It was initially created as a way to control the youth and to get the youth to basically leave their parents and not listen to what their parents were trying to teach them about morals. But but it did get out of their hands. Because I think eventually what started to happen, especially towards the end of the career of the Beatles, right before they broke up and subsequently started putting out solo records, I think what ended up happening, certainly with John Lennon, who didn't put out records for 3 or 4 or 5 years. The guy just basically retired to his suite in New York there and didn't do anything. And I think what ended up happening inevitably is they started figuring out that they were controlled. And they started figuring out that they were not in control of their own destiny. They had been indeed used. I think some of the comments that John Lennon made in his final days sort of were very indicative of that. But I think that that's a key element here. Is it did get out of their hands. What started out as something of control started roping in all sorts of people from all sorts of walks of life, and it started getting people rebelling not only against what originally was started to get them to leave their morals behind, started waking people up to the bigger picture of the New World Order and to the bigger picture of things. And so they started getting off the plantation. At that point, John Lennon became a threat, and they had to eliminate what they had created, you see. It's just like everything. They take these people, they use them for their own devices, and when they can't be used for their own devices anymore, they eliminate them. Common tactic. The Beatles were also part of the mass experimentation that contemporary society was being subjected to by the CIA, Britain's MI6, and the Tavistock Institute, utilizing extraordinarily powerful, mind-altering psychedelic psychotropic drugs. More than most of the other boys in the band, John Lennon became increasingly aware not only of the extent of corruption, co-opting, and infiltration of the counterculture, but most certainly including the rock music scene by these same covert government intelligence elements. Well, and of course, George Harrison, who of course is my favorite Beatle. George Harrison, he tells the story. If you ever seen the Beatles anthology series of videos, George Harrison actually talked about how when he first went to Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s, and how he was excited to go there because he was under the impression that San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury and stuff at the time was, this mecca of enlightened people and truth seekers and people that were really, looking for the truth. And he said when he got there, it was just a bunch of, degenerate drug addicts. And that there wasn't any sort of, revolution going on. There wasn't any sort of enlightenment happening. It was just a bunch of teenagers on dope. And he expressed his concerns about that, and so, of course, look, and I always knew we'd end up with the two crappiest Beatles left, Paul and Ringo. My goodness, the two safe ones they left us with Why? Because Paul and Ringo have never said anything against the New World Order. Of course not. In fact, Paul McCartney, my Sir Paul, come on. I hate Paul McCartney. Maca nightmare, as I call it. Get stuck in the Maca nightmare. I love you. What a big piece of cheese, man. Maca is a big old piece of cheese. God, I can't stand Maca. Man, what do you call a dog with fleas? I'm sorry, what do you call it? What do you call a dog with wings? Linda McCartney. More on the other side. This is the global reality, folks. Stay with us. Let's get back here into this information. I want to talk about this days of the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. Shortly before Lyndon's death, at the hands of what became the faintest glimmer of a shadow of a doubt was a mind-controlled Manchurian candidate-type assassin deployed by the Tavistock CIA MI6, Mark David Chapman, to terminate a loose cannon. Lyndon had the audacity to massively and blatantly out the aforementioned consortium in a Playboy interview, in which he made note of LSD's completely unforeseen liberating impact upon human society and civilization, pretty much thumbing his nose at the whole bunch of their whole trip and indicating as well that he was aware of the extent to which he and other pop musicians had been set up to be used as dupes in massive and social manipulation schemes. Shortly afterward, New World Order head honcho and Satanist global CIA chief Tavistock underling Vice President George Bush had Lennon slaughtered on the streets of New York, where he died in the arms of someone that a number of sources claim was the monarch agent deployed by MI6 CIA to keep the exceptionally intelligent Lennon constantly gravitating toward the social fringe, thereby keeping his potential influence at least minimized. Yoko Ono. That's not to say that even if this last supposition is true, that genuine love and a fulfilling relationship did not exist between the two, that Yoko's programming, just like John's, broke up and fell apart. Yeah, Yoko is about as New World Order as it gets, man. Have you guys ever seen that quote? Type, I dare you, If you haven't seen this, you're probably not going to believe me. You have to see it for yourself. But I dare you, if you don't believe me right now, to type into a search engine, Yoko Ono, Georgia Guidestones, and see what you come up with. There's actually a quote of Yoko Ono talking about how she believes that what the Georgia Guidestones say are great and they're true, and she believes in the message. And of course, we talked about, if you guys have seen the picture, that some idiot, and I know who probably did this. It looks like the work of one of these clowns that calls in to talk radio shows and tries to disrupt them. I'm sure it's probably one of them. But somebody went and spray painted a bunch of like 9/11 inside job, and the elite want to depopulate 8% of us, and Obama are a Muslim. Somebody went and spray painted this all over the Georgia Guidestones, and to try to make it appear that this was done by someone in the Patriot or Truth movement, and of course nobody's buying it. I mean, everybody knows this was done by somebody who is attempting to neutralize the movement and get us blamed for something. You're going to see more of that. You know, you'll definitely see more of that. But nonetheless, let's continue here. And what about those Beatles anyway? Anyone who has heard the Beatles live tapes recorded in 61 and 62 on the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, Germany, realizes this was an incredibly talented, energetic bunch of rockers who, no matter what, would have undoubtedly had a significant impact upon popular music and thus upon society itself, regardless of things which occurred subsequently in their saga. And without any doubt, being given access to the state-of-the-art audio and recording technologies and facilities stimulated their creativity quite a bit for the benefit of all. Personally, I think the Beatles were definitely the greatest or damn close to it. And so there's one aspect of that. And so, you know, there's more and more of this stuff that continues to come out. Now there's other information where people have said that things like, then there's this other disinformation. The Beatles had two greatest hits collections. One was called Past Masters, and the other one was called Past Masters Volume 1, Volume 2. And then there's other people that have said that, this is a Masonic reference, because past master is a Masonic term used to describe a former worshipful master of a Masonic lodge. And if you take all the number of tracks that were on Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the Beatles' Past Masters Volume 1 and 2, they add up to 33. Very interesting. Whether or not that is intentional or not, I don't know. Could be, could not be. But interesting nonetheless that it does, the name is Past Masters. That is a Masonic term, and of course, 33 tracks on both. Nonetheless, that's it's still, you know, and I don't think that was probably something that probably wasn't done by them, but more rather someone at the record label, Capitol Records, who was probably more than likely did that. But, you know, there's more of this stuff, lots of this stuff out there, and I just thought it would be interesting to talk about today. We're coming on a break here again in a second. Now, what I want to get into on for the rest of the show, probably at least for an hour, is I want to get back into reading The Finding of the Third Eye by Vera Stanley Alder and pick up where we left off on the next chapter, where we left off on Friday. Very interesting book. It was one of the first books I read about 10 years ago that sort of got me down this path, and now reading it on air has really made me realize that this is really what got me to where I am now, and also it's validating a lot of the research and is making a lot more sense to me now than it did really in the is Paul the real Paul? That's a good question, isn't it? You know, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories that Paul was actually killed and that they created a guy, gave him plastic surgery, made him look like Paul, and then put him in the place of Paul McCartney. Well, you know what? I will say this. I don't know how there's anything true to that or not, but I will say this. At the point at which the whole Paul is dead thing happened, and the time in which the alleged fake Paul came into the picture, was right about the time Paul McCartney started sucking ass. That was right about the time that his music just completely went to the toilet. So maybe it is true. Maybe they replaced him with a guy who was a crappy songwriter. I don't know. Maybe that's the conspiracy. All right, more on the other side. We're going to read out of The Finding of the Third Eye by Vera Stanley Alder, folks. Stay with us. Wait, he's exactly right. I mean, John Coleman, who wrote this, who's an ex-MI6, ex-TAP, I mean, this guy was there. But the 12 atonal system consisted of heavy, repetitive sounds taken from the music of the cult of Dionysus and the Baal priesthood by Adorno, and gave a modern flavor by the special friend of Queen of England, and hence the Committee of 300. Tavistock and its Stanford Research Center created trigger words, which then came into general usage around rock music and its fans. Trigger words created a distinct new breakaway, a largely young population group, which was persuaded by social engineering and conditioning to believe that the Beatles really were their favorite group. All trigger words, devised in the context of rock music, were designed for mass control of the new targeted group, the youth of America. The Beatles did a perfect job, or perhaps it would be more correct to say that the Tavistock and the Stanford Research Institute did a perfect job. The Beatles were merely reacting like trained robots, with a little help from their friends, code words for using drugs and making it recognized as unwelcome change by the large population group in the sites of the Stanford Research Institute was the advent of the Beatles. The Beatles were brought to the United States as part of a social experiment which will subject large population groups to brainwashing, of which they were not even aware. When Tavistock brought the Beatles to the United States, nobody could have imagined the cultural disaster that was to follow in their wake. The Beatles were an integral part of the Aquarian Conspiracy, a living organism which sprang from the changing images of man. Year H49-2150, the Policy Research Report number on 474. The policy report prepared by the SRI Center for the Study of Social Policy Director Professor Willis Harman. The phenomenon of the Beatles was not a spontaneous rebellion by youth against the old social system. Instead, it was a carefully crafted plot to introduce a conspiratorial body which could not be identified. A highly destructive and divisive element into a large population group targeted for change against its will. New words and new phrases prepared by the Tavistock Institute were introduced into America along with the Beatles. This is one of the topics that probably I get the most questions about. And I plan on doing a film on this subject in the future. And really the New World Order control, the cult of Dionysus, and how it relates to rock music. So I thought today, being the, what is this, the 28th anniversary of the shooting of John Lennon from the Beatles. So I thought that would be, since today is the anniversary of that shooting, I thought we would read out of Dr. John Coleman, the Committee of 300, author of the book, The Committee of 300. Michael Vale has told me he's trying to get him on the program, on the Intel Strike Report. But, so I thought it would be interesting today to read out of the Committee of 300, the Beatles and the Aquarian Conspiracy, here on the day of the 20th anniversary of the assassination of John Lennon. An outstanding example of social conditioning to accept change, even when it is words such as rock in relation to music sounds, teenager, cool, discovered, and pop music were a lexicon of disguised code words signifying the acceptance of drugs and arrived with and accompanied the Beatles wherever they went, to be discovered by teenagers. Incidentally, the word teenagers was never used until just before the Beatles arrived on the scene, courtesy of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. As in the case of gang wars, nothing could or would have been accomplished without the cooperation of the media, especially the electronic media, and in particular, the scurrilous Ed Sullivan, who had been coached by the conspirators as the role he was to play. Nobody would have paid much attention to the motley crew from Liverpool and the 12-atonal system of music that was to follow had it not been for an overabundance of press exposure. The 12-atonal system consisted of heavy, repetitive sounds taken from the music of the cult of Dionysus and the Baal priesthood by Adorno, and given a modern flavor by this special friend of the Queen of England, and hence the Committee of 300. Now that is true. Now that the 12-atonal system of music, it's a 12-atonal system in which chords are designed in a certain cool. The Beatles became a highly visible new type, more Tavistock jargon, and as such it was not long before the group made new styles, fads in clothing, hairstyles, and language usage, which upset the older generation, as was intended. This was part of the fragmentation maladaptation process worked out by Willis Harman and his team of social scientists and genetic engineering tinkers and put into action. The role of the print and electronic media in our society is crucial to the success of brainwashing large population groups. Gang wars ended in Los Angeles in 1966 as the media withdrew its coverage. The same thing will happen with the current wave of gang wars in Los Angeles. Street gangs will wither on the vine once media saturation coverage is toned down and then completely withdrawn. As in 1966, the issue will become burned out. Street gangs will serve their purpose of creating turbulence and insecurity. Exactly the same pattern will be followed in the case of rock music. Deprived of media attention, it will eventually take its place in history. Following the Beatles, who incidentally were put together by the Tavistock Institute, came other made-in-England rock groups who, like the Beatles, had Theo Adorno